Good morning and afternoon, depending on where you're based and where you live. Welcome to today's webinar, Understanding and Tackling Scope 3 Emissions in the Global Push for Sustainability. As Fred said, my name's Rob Scheckman, and I'm really excited to guide you through this critical and timely topic. Before we dive in, let's take a moment to reflect on why we're here today. As the world accelerates its sustainability efforts, Scope 3 emissions, the indirect emissions across the entire value chain, have become a focal point. These emissions are often the largest share of a company's carbon footprint, yet they are also the most challenging to address. In today's session, we'll cover what Scope 3 emissions are and why they matter, the unique challenges companies face in managing these emissions, innovative solutions that are paving the way for measurable impact, and actionable steps you can take to start addressing Scope 3 emissions effectively. Now, before we dive in, I wanted to share that I recently heard someone refer to Scope 3 emissions as sneaky emissions. And they went on to say that similar to snacks that you binge on and never count the calories of those snacks, for some reason, they end up showing up on the scale. In other words, Scope 3 emissions show up on companies when companies least expect it. And you'll see exactly what I mean when we start to dig in. And our goal today is to equip you with a deeper understanding of Scope 3 and inspire you to take meaningful action within your organization. Now, there's two reasons why I picked this topic. On a professional level, I'm proud to work for a company, Provision AI, that eliminates Scope 3 emissions every single day. On a personal level, I'm excited to introduce a special guest who is on this call. This person recently graduated from Vermont Law School with a law degree and master's in sustainability. He currently works as an environmental policy analyst for an environmental advocacy organization. His passion for sustainability has definitely rubbed off on me, and he just happens to have the same last name as mine. I'm proud of my son. Adam, just please say a quick hi to everyone.
Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Thanks, Dad.
Yeah, no problem. And it's my first father-son webinar, by the way. I suspect that you'll hear from Adam at times throughout the webinar when we talk about some legal and policy related stuff. All right. I think a good place to start is the definition of Scope 3 emissions. And I apologize up front for a fairly detailed definition, but I think it's pretty important to get down to that level to kind of set the scene. So Scope 3 emissions refer to the indirect greenhouse gas emissions that occur across a company's value chain, but are not directly produced by the company itself or from the energy it purchases. Direct emissions are classified as Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Scope 3 emissions encompass a broad range of activities, including those upstream and those downstream in the value chain. I'll get to those in a minute. Scope 3 is divided into 15 categories as defined by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which include purchased goods and services, transportation and distribution, employee commuting, which actually to me was a sneaky emissions, as I mentioned before, because I didn't expect that to be part of Scope 3. And finally, end-of-life treatment of sold products, among others. Consider a food manufacturing company. Some examples of their upstream emissions are emissions from growing, harvesting, and transporting raw ingredients like wheat or sugar, manufacturing emissions from the packaging supplier, fuel consumption from trucks delivering ingredients to the manufacturing plant. Some examples of their downstream emissions would be transportation emissions from delivering finished products to a distribution center or a retailer, emissions from refrigeration at a retail store on shelves that are actually storing the product, the finished goods, and waste generated by consumers from product packaging. For instance, if a cereal company sources wheat from a supplier, the emissions generated from farming and transporting that wheat to the cereal factory are part of a company's Scope 3 emissions. Additionally, transporting finished goods between plants and DCs or transferring from one DC to another also falls under Scope 3 if you contract it out to a third-party carrier. Okay, now that we know what Scope 3 is, so what? why does scope 3 matter, and why does it matter now more than ever? Well, the urgency around scope 3 emissions stems from three key factors. It's important to provide real examples so you can kind of bring them to life when we go through them. Number one, global climate goals. That's definitely why there's some urgency around scope 3. With initiatives like the Paris Agreement and net zero pledges, companies are under pressure to reduce their carbon footprints, not just within their operation, but across their entire value chain. I'm sure everyone heard the news, the US participation in the Paris Agreement just recently changed as of a couple of weeks ago, but a global company will still need to look beyond US borders to adhere to the agreement and to their goals.
That's exactly right. And I'll just add that despite these political shifts in the US, not only do you have many individual states who continue to have unwavering climate goals, you also have examples like Michael Bloomberg, whose philanthropy is actually fulfilling the US's financial commitments under the Paris Agreement. And I also wanted to mention that the private sector itself drives most of global climate reductions. And so this sector is key for making real climate progress.
Thanks, Adam. Appreciate it. And I just wanted to bring out one example of a global climate goals and why that's driven some urgency. In alignment with the Paris Agreement, Unilever has pledged to achieve net zero emissions across its entire value chain by 2039. This includes emissions from suppliers, transportation, and product usage. To meet these ambitious targets, Unilever has implemented supplier engagement programs, shifted to renewable energy, and introduced circular packaging solutions to reduce life cycle emissions. We're honored to say that here at Provision AI, Unilever is one of our loyal and valued customers. The second reason why there's some urgency around scope 3 are stakeholder expectations, especially in the EU, but to a certain extent in the US as well. Investors, customers, and regulators are demanding transparency and action on scope 3 emissions. Failure to address these can lead to reputational risks and financial penalties. An example of this would be the CSRD, or the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, which came into effect just last year in 2024. This requires large companies operating in the EU to report detailed information on their environmental, social, and governance performance, including scope 3 emissions. This directive applies not only to European companies, and this is important to highlight, but also non-EU companies with significant operations in the region.
And these reporting requirements are also becoming more prevalent in the US as well. For instance, the SEC issued a rule last March that requires public companies to disclose climate-related information, including Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, starting this year. Scope 3 emissions might be added to that SEC rule in the future. There's also California's new Climate Corporate Data Accountability Act, which requires public companies who do business in California with annual revenues over $1 billion to report their greenhouse gas emissions, including their Scope 3 emissions. In the first year of reporting under this California law, which is 2026, companies are not going to be penalized for inaccurate or incomplete records because it's such a new thing. But as long as they act in good faith, and some of the compliance dates of that law might be pushed back, and there's also ongoing litigation regarding this California law, but it's likely to take effect before that lawsuit is resolved. So essentially, as emissions reporting grows, companies may face increasing legal risks if they fail to meet transparency or reduction commitments. So early implementation would definitely reduce any future risks.
Thank you, Adam. I already see you're starting to put your law degree at use here, so I appreciate that. Thank you for adding some value there. The third reason for urgency around scope 3, and this is really an interesting one, opportunities for innovation. So tackling scope 3 emissions often uncovers inefficiencies and fosters collaboration, leading to cost savings and competitive advantages. A really good example of this one is Walmart's Project Gigaton. They were able to eliminate 1 billion metric tons. I'm going to repeat that, 1 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases from its supply chain 6 years ahead of schedule. Very impressive. This initiative spurred innovation by encouraging roughly 5,900 suppliers to adopt more efficient manufacturing practices, optimize transportation routes, and reduce waste. As a result, Walmart not only achieved emissions reductions, but also identified cost savings opportunities and strengthened its partnerships with suppliers committed to sustainability. In short, addressing Scope 3 emissions is not just an environmental imperative, it's a strategic opportunity. Okay, at this point, you now know what Scope 3 is, if you didn't before, and why it's important. Here are a couple key statistics highlighting the significance of Scope 3 in supply chain emissions, and these stats are staggering, to say the least. Scope 3 is by far the largest emission source. On average, Scope 3 emissions account for 70 to 95% of a company's total carbon footprint, significantly outweighing Scope 1, which are the direct emissions, or Scope 2, which are indirect emissions from energy consumption. And if you drill down to industry-specific sectors like retail, manufacturing, and food production, Scope 3 emissions can exceed 95% of total emissions. This certainly reinforces why Scope 3 is so important to address. And another staggering statistic is the major target gap that exists in the marketplace. Only 15% of companies globally have established Scope 3 emissions reduction targets, despite the overwhelming share of emissions they represent. So what are some of the major challenges and hurdles that you need to get past to measure and manage Scope 3 effectively? Well, there are really two things. One is the complexity of the data collection, and secondly is the lack of standardization. Let me go into a little bit of detail here. Scope 3 emissions span the entire value chain of a company, including activities that are often outside of its direct control. Collecting data to measure and report these emissions is very complex because it requires input from multiple stakeholders, suppliers, logistic providers, customers, and even end users across diverse geographies, industries, and processes. It's pretty complex. The variability in data formats, standards, and levels of transparency among these stakeholders further complicates this task. An example would be transporting product internally from a plant to a DC, or even transporting product directly to a retailer. Finished products are distributed globally with emissions depending on whether the shipment is by truck, rail car, or ocean container. Gathering precise emission data from third-party logistics providers can be very challenging.
I did want to mention on this point that the EPA has actually issued guidance on measuring and reporting Scope 3 emissions, including a very detailed report, which offers in-depth explanations on how to measure and report these emissions. And the EPA also has other resources like the Center for Corporate Climate Leadership, which offers tools, guidance, educational resources, information sharing, all to help organizations manage their emissions. So if you're thinking about this, definitely check out the EPA's website, and I'm also going to set it in the chat, which I hope you can all see.
Fantastic. Thank you, Adam. Appreciate that. Now, even though it is challenging to measure and manage, and Adam gave you some suggestions on how you might be able to go about it, and there are definitely some obstacles there, but there are tons of ways that you can reduce these emissions. And here are 10 actionable steps that companies can take to reduce their Scope 3 emissions. I can't possibly go into each one in detail on this webinar, but I'm happy to connect with you afterwards, one-on-one after the webinar, and I'll provide my contact information at the end so we can get in touch. So here we go. Here's the top 10 or my top 10 list on how to reduce Scope 3. Number one, seems very obvious, engaging with your suppliers on sustainability, but it really is not being done as widespread as it should be. You should collaborate with your suppliers to improve their environmental performance through training, workshops. You can even establish sustainability standards. Number two, optimize transportation and logistics. We've seen over the last 4 or 5 years the shift to more efficient modes of transportation, such as rail or sea, instead of air. And certainly you can use load building optimization tools to maximize vehicle capacity and minimize empty miles. This is 100% Provision AI's core competency is load building optimization. Number 3, adopt digital twins and AI for efficiency. You can use digital twin technology to model and optimize supply chain processes. We have a solution here at Provision AI called Level Load that simulates and makes recommendations to drive significant efficiencies regarding supply network scheduling. This is just one example of a digital twin. You can also employ AI to forecast demand, reduce waste, and streamline operations. Number 4, redesign products for sustainability. You can look to use recyclable, biodegradable, or lower carbon materials in your product design as an example. 5, promote renewable energy in the value chain. Encourage your suppliers to switch to renewable energy sources. That would be a good example of that. Implement circular economy practices. You can create programs to recycle or repurpose products at the end of their life cycle. Of course, that depends on the category and product that you're actually selling. 7, foster sustainable procurement. You can prioritize sourcing from suppliers with strong environmental credentials, or you can set your procurement policies that favor low carbon and eco-friendly materials. Here is that sneaky emission that I mentioned before, reducing your employee travel or commuting. We know that in the last 4 or 5 years, people were either working from home more than ever before. Perhaps now there's more of a hybrid model. And then as employees come back to work, you can encourage them to use public transportation, carpooling, and so on. Investing in carbon offsets is number 9, the 9th way to reduce scope 3. You can partner with verified carbon offset programs to neutralize any avoidable emissions that you might have. And last but not least, educate customers on sustainability. You can create awareness campaigns to encourage customers to use products responsibly. You can provide guidance on how to dispose of the products sustainably or even reduce their own carbon footprints. By implementing these strategies or some of these strategies, companies can make significant progress in reducing scope 3 emissions while driving innovation and operational efficiency. And while you're beginning to take those action steps, you can start to build out a roadmap to achieve your scope 3 goals. I'll run through these pretty quick. You can collaborate with your suppliers, which I just mentioned before, define their role and align with their goals to reduce scope 3. Along the way, you might be able to incentivize those suppliers to adopt low carbon practices. Of course, always set achievable and measurable targets. You definitely need to integrate your scope 3 initiatives in your broader ESG goals to help close that target gap that I discussed earlier. And then typically with sustainability, cost efficiency is the result because you're eliminating waste, but certainly look to balance those two and look at both sides of the formula on the cost and the benefit side of the formula. And then last, you can leverage frameworks like Science-Based Targets Initiative, which is a platform that helps companies and their suppliers align with science-based targets to decarbonize entire value chains. So those are some of the ways you can build out your roadmap. Now I have a short video to show you, and it's related to building out a successful roadmap to achieve your sustainability goals. It highlights Riviana Foods, which is one of our customers, and how they collaborate, their collaborative approach to scope 3 reductions, leveraging the solutions that Provision AI offers. The video clip is from Talking Logistics podcast with Adrian Gonzalez. It includes 2 leaders from Riviana, the director of transportation and the manager of continuous improvement. And of course, you'll see on the screen our fearless leader, Tom Moore.
The main thing, and then the other, of course, was we're tracking sustainability with Ebro in Spain. And so, of course, with the emissions and reducing the number of loads and the savings, not only in freight costs and cost per hundredweight, but also in the sustainability side of the arena.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, I think, the challenges you brought up, I think, are common for many companies because I hear, same types of things, particularly when you've got a, diversity of products And, sometimes you're being driven by, we just have to, we have to get the product out. And, in terms of having a consistent process in place or some kind of discipline in place defined to be able to do it in the most efficient and effective way possible is, something that is lacking in many companies. I think the other aspect is, you brought up sustainability. And I think that's another area that we're hearing a lot more from shippers as well. That's driving a lot of initiatives around transportation management, considering the role that transportation plays in carbon emissions and just in being able to achieve the sustainability goals that companies have.
And you could see that entire video along with a whole bunch of other videos on our YouTube channel. You can search for Provision AI on YouTube to be able to see that.
The main thing was tracking sustainability with Abro in Spain.
All right, we had a bunch of questions come in, and Fred was nice enough to consolidate those questions. And please keep those questions coming in because we'd love to follow up with you on a one-on-one basis. I'm taking a look at the time here. I just want to be conscious of everyone's time, so I'm going to take really just one question, and actually a few of you did have the same question, which is I think on everyone's mind these days, which is what is the cost-benefit analysis of investing in Scope 3 reduction initiatives, and how can companies measure ROI? So I think this is definitely a question that a lot of people are asking in the industry. So there's certainly a lot to unpack with this question. I can't go into a bunch of detail on the webinar. Again, happy to address this afterwards. But the bottom line is you need to compare both the investment or the cost side of the formula to the benefits. And obviously, if the benefits outweigh the cost, that's probably an area that you want to explore to move forward with. I'll give you some examples of some real costs and investment side of the equation. Certainly, if you're going to invest in any data or the collection of that data, perhaps investing in new software to be able to collect Scope 3 and reduce it. Secondly, if you have any supplier engagement, like the time training and the time and resources it takes to train those suppliers would definitely be a real cost. Any operational changes, such as switching to lower carbon material in production would be a real cost as well. And any costs associated with certification or compliance would add to that cost side of the formula. On the benefit side, the hope is that the largest benefit would be cost savings. So an example would be improved fuel efficiency or maybe shipping less trucks overall. That should be hopefully the largest bucket. Secondly, are you able to reduce any risk by reducing exposure to regulatory penalties? That would be a real cost if that came into fruition. Next one is a little more difficult to measure, but reputational brand value. So are you aligning with your customer values for sustainability? There's certainly ways to estimate that on market share or revenue. And then last but not least, are you able to gain a competitive advantage, or are you bringing innovation to the marketplace? Certainly gaining a first mover advantage in new markets would help you drive share and revenue. A shameless plug for Provision AI. We typically can deliver a positive ROI in the first 3 to 6 months of working with us. And I'm happy to go into how we go about evaluating that with our customers. Okay, just to kind of recap what we talked about today, and I know we're up on time, so I appreciate everyone hanging in there. Scope 3, let's kind of start with Scope 3 emissions matter. Scope 3 emissions represent the largest portion of most supply chain emissions, making them critical for achieving sustainability goals. I think I hear some background noise, if you guys can cut that off. Thank you. Regulatory pressures are rising in the EU and also to a certain extent in the US. Governments and industry standards are increasingly focusing on Scope 3 disclosures, pushing companies to act. This already has extended to the US, as we see with new SEC rules and laws in California, as Adam mentioned earlier. Collaboration is key. Effective reduction strategies require collaboration across suppliers, partners, and logistics providers. Data is the foundation. You need accurate, actionable data and advanced tools like digital twins. They're essential for identifying and mitigating Scope 3 emissions. Of course, cost savings opportunities. reducing Scope 3 emissions often aligns with operational efficiencies, such as optimizing transportation and reducing waste. And then the bottom line is act now. Any delays in addressing Scope 3 emissions could lead to missed opportunities, reputational risks, and higher compliance costs in the future. I'm going to leave off with just saying that I hope you found this webinar informative, educational, and actionable. Please feel free to connect with me after this webinar. My email is robert.scheckman@provisionai.com. You see my cell phone number there. You can find me on LinkedIn. And if you want to connect with Adam to get more perspective on environmental and legal policy, please, contact me and I'll be happy to provide that information as well. Everyone, please have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time.